if the companies and the governments from far away come, they just want to extract resources, and they'll destroy our lands and our cultures if we let them.
The Amazon rainforest acts as a massive carbon sink, absorbing large amounts of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and storing it in its trees and soil, essentially acting as the lungs of the earth and helping to stabilize global climate. But its destruction doesn't just threaten rising carbon dioxide levels, it also endangers indigenous communities and accelerates the impacts of climate change. In a world driven by profit, big oil and powerful corporations relentlessly pursue drilling and mining in the Amazon, exploiting its resources with little regard for the consequences. Protecting this rainforest and honoring the autonomy of its indigenous peoples is a global imperative. The time to stand together is now. As part of our Concordia Summit series, we sat down with Nemonte, Nenquimo, and Mitch Anderson of Amazon Frontlines. Nemonte, born into the Waorani tribe in Ecuador's Amazon rainforest, has become one of the world's most powerful voices for climate action. Her leadership in a landmark victory against big oil protected over 500,000 acres of rainforest and earned her global recognition, included being named one of Time magazine's 100 most influential people and receiving the Goldman Environmental Prize in 2020. In this episode, we'll explore their newly released memoir, We Will Be Jaguars, which shares Nemonte's life story, her people's ancestral wisdom, and the indigenous fight to protect the Amazon. We'll also discuss recent victories against big oil and the work of Amazon Frontlines, which was recently awarded the Hilton Humanitarian Prize. Defending the Amazon is more than an indigenous struggle. It's a global responsibility. A quick note, this episode was recorded in both Spanish and English. In this version, you'll primarily hear Mitch translating Nemonte's answers.
All right. Well, welcome back to the Green Hour. We are doing a series at the Concordia Annual Summit, after the summit. And today we're talking with Nemonte, Nenquimo, and Mitch Anderson, co-founders of Amazon Frontlines. This conversation is going to span a lot of topics, one being a new book, Nemonte's memoir, We Will Be Jaguars. We'll talk about Amazon Frontlines, and then we'll talk about two really large victories for indigenous communities across South America. So first things first, Mitch and Nemonte, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah. So first things first, probably like a month ago, maybe a little bit more than a month ago, there was a book that was released. Nemonte, this is your memoir. It's called We Will Be Jaguars. And I read it. It's incredible. What I love about it is the imagery. When I read, I can really, visualize and see what you saw even as a young girl in your community in Ecuador. And one of the cool things that I've researched and found from this book is, ancestral knowledge and wisdom about life in the forest, have been passed down orally for millennia. And the tradition of storytelling has never really manifested its way on paper. And with your people, the Waorani people, these stories have never been out in the public. And now we have a book, a memoir that actually takes us on a journey through your entire life, from childhood all the way to adulthood. And we see all sorts of things. We see how you fought against big corporations, big oil companies. We saw how it just your life just basically transformed. So the first question I have for you is, how important is storytelling in getting these stories of the Waorani people out in the public on paper?
Bueno, primeramente, nosotros, cultura Waorani, no somos escritores.
So you're right. For thousands of years, my people have been telling stories orally. We've been passing down our stories throughout the generations. That's the way we pass down our knowledge, our secrets. That's the way we've stayed alive. And over the last years with Mitch and with my team, we've been battling to protect our lands, to protect our cultures. We've won big victories against the oil companies, against the mining industry. And what we've realized in winning these big victories is that the threats continue. The threats are unrelenting. And as an Indigenous woman who wants to live in the forest, raising my family, my children, so they can eat well, so that the forest can nourish them, the rivers can be clean, realize that these threats continue to come. And over years, I also listened to my elders, listened to my father, and they've told me that the outside world destroys what it doesn't understand. And so I realized that in order to make the outside world understand who Indigenous peoples are, our connection with the land, why it's important to protect our land, it was time to write my story down. It was time to write our people's story in a book to share with the rest of the world. And, as I say in the introduction to We Will Be Jaguars, in our culture, a story dies when no one tells it. And so I wrote this story in a book now so that it will never die, and that the people around the world can understand who we are as Warani people, as Indigenous peoples, and we can protect our territories.
On the point of, the fight never stops. I think it's really cool. When I was researching the title of the book, We Will Be Jaguars, I was and also reading the book, you kind of uncover it. In the Wołani culture, the jaguar, what I have down is it represents strength, courage, and connection to the natural world. And the name of the book, it really symbolizes the fierce resistance of your people and other Indigenous communities as you fight to defend your land and life from threats, like you're saying, of mining companies, oil companies, and a lot of times just greed is what I would say. So the question I would ask is, could you talk a little bit about, the title of this book and what the word jaguar represents for your people?
Para mi pueblos, antiguamente, el jaguar era su dios, que venía a su
For my people, for the Warani people, for our ancestors, the jaguar is our God. It's our spiritual connection with our territory, with nature. The jaguar communicates with us in visions, in dreams. Through the jaguar, we're able to learn about the future. We're able to call the wild boar, the wild peccary closer to the village. We're able to learn about dangers. And also, as a Warani person, when we die, our body, which is made of earth, will return to the ground, to the land. But our spirits will become spirit jaguars in the afterlife. A female Warani in life will become a male spirit jaguar in the afterlife. And a Warani man in life will become a female spirit jaguar in the afterlife. And so we are protecting and fighting to protect our lands now, like the jaguar fights. But we also are protecting our lands because in the afterlife, we will be spirit jaguars roaming these very territories where we're living today. That's why we named our book, We Will Be Jaguars.
Yeah, I love that. That's incredible. I will say, reading the beginning of the book, as I said in the beginning, the imagery, it's really cool just to be able to kind of visualize, what was happening when you were a young girl and how your whole life kind of unfolded. And one of the things that I remember in the beginning of the book is in your community, there was a missionary that you talk about in the community, and you would describe sky people. Sky people would be coming down, and they would be meeting, and really the only person that would talk to the sky people was the missionary. And as a young girl, you would see this and you would hide, and you would almost look at the sky people as people that maybe even like superhuman. These are people that come from the sky that have maybe even have powers. And I remember reading that, and I was like, this is for someone like me, for someone that's lived in the U.S., that's been around this culture, my entire life. It's something that I never would have even thought about as seeing a different group of people as someone like sky people coming down, and it was super interesting to read that. But the question that I have kind of goes more in depth, but it's really about, can you talk a little bit about, the experience growing up between the traditions of your people and then the influence of outsiders and people that came into the community and how it really shaped the view of your world?
Yo crecí en dos mundos desde muy pequeña, porque mientras los misioneros sobrevolaban, hablaban sobre salvación de alma.
Nemo said that I grew up in two worlds, between two worlds. And I was a curious little girl, and I had questions. I wanted to know, is this God that the white people, the missionaries talk about in the sky, is he real? can I hear from him? And then I would go to my elders and I would learn about the jaguar in the forest and talk with them and like wonder about the jaguar, and will I hear from the jaguar? Am I gonna have visions of the jaguar? There was the daughter of one of the missionaries was my friend. And she always was, saying she prayed to God and she heard from him. And so I wanted to pray to God and see if I could hear from him, but I never did. And in my dreams, I would always dream of the forest. I would dream of animals. I would dream of life in the forest. The God of the white people never came to me in my dreams. And I even wanted things from the white people. I wanted like a little blue dress. I wanted dresses. And I would even pretend that I believed in the God of the white people so that I could get those dresses, so I could get those things. And so really I grew up in the middle of the forest in a Warani village, but really between two worlds.
A note that I wrote down directly in line with that is, in living and growing up in two worlds, I mean, today you look at the Amazon rainforest, and the stat that I have down is 35% of the Amazon is protected by indigenous communities. We did a series the last few months with the Nature Conservancy in Latin America, and one of our episodes was focused on indigenous communities. And what I learned is areas of the Amazon that are protected by indigenous communities perform far better than the other areas of the Amazon. And it kind of opened up my eyes because, as a world, the Amazon is the lungs of this earth. And when we talk about environmental issues and talk about climate change, it's like the Amazon is so important. And what I learned is indigenous people and indigenous communities, are the key to the future and us preserving our planet. So, I just ask you, your thoughts and your view on indigenous communities inside the Amazon rainforest, and how you work, and how your whole community works to protect these lands inside the Amazon.
Yo creo que esto es conocimiento ancestral que nos han transmitido nuestros abuelos, nuestros mayores.
Indigenous peoples are the guardians of the forest. We're the guardians of our territories, and that really has to do with the knowledge that we've carried with us and that have been passed down by our ancestors over thousands of years. And in that knowledge also is deep values and respect for the land. We pay attention. We listen to Mother Earth. We watch the moon and the sun, the rivers. We understand the animals. And we're very, very aware that we're part of the forest and that Mother Earth and the forest are giving us life. And if the forest is threatened, we feel threatened. If the forest becomes sick, then we feel sick. If the forest dies, then we will die and we will become disconnected from the land. We'll lose our language, our culture. And that's why we're dedicating our life, our collective struggle to protecting the forest. And that's why in our homes and our territories, the forest is much better protected. The animals are much better protected than in other areas of the Amazon that we're not currently stewarding.
What's interesting to me is you look at the statistics, everything's out there, and it's like, yeah, these areas perform better under indigenous community control. So, why are big oil companies, big corporations continuing to try to go in these areas and extract resources, pollute the areas, drive people out through mining, through all these different things? And in my own life, in the U.S., I went to a school in Eastern Kentucky called University of Pikeville. And, Pikeville is a very impoverished area in Appalachia. And back probably in the 80s, 90s, early 2000s, coal miners and big coal companies came in the area and basically took over the area and gave jobs and livelihood to all the people in this community. And what happened was the areas in Eastern Kentucky were destroyed through the mining. The environment was affected. The health of the people were, you had stuff like black lung that went around, and people were getting sick. But at the end of the day, they were kind of tied to this career in what these big corporations promised, which was a better life and money and in a way to feed your kids, basically. So I've never been to South America, but I relate that struggle of, in Appalachia and Pikeville, Kentucky, and seeing what it's done to the area. I mean, today you have a huge drug problem, because people, to cope with the awful conditions in these mines, they would start taking narcotics, and then once the coal mines closed, they were still on the narcotics, and now you don't have a job, and now there's not opportunities there for the people. So that's a long spill, but I relate it because you have greed, and you have big corporations and companies everywhere that are just trying to take advantage of people and places and communities. And it's just something that continues to happen. And I wish it wouldn't. And in this case of the Amazon, again, you go back to the numbers, you go back to the stats. It's like, please, let's just let the indigenous people control these lands, because us as a world, we need the Amazon to survive and thrive as it is, if we don't want to have the effects of climate change.
Los pueblos indígenas, realmente los amazónicos, somos primer filas de solución cambio climáticos.
Nemonte said that indigenous peoples, we're not destroying our homes. We don't destroy our homes. We don't destroy our fishing holes. We don't destroy our hunting grounds, because it's our home. We live there. It gives us life. We know that. And we know that if the companies and the governments from far away come, they just want to extract resources, and they'll destroy our lands and our cultures if we let them. And we know as well that we're not just fighting for ourselves right now, we're fighting for future generations, and we're fighting to protect the Amazon rainforest, which sustains life on Earth and which stabilizes our climate. And so that's why I wrote this book, We Will Be Jaguars. That's why I told the story of my childhood, because I really did want to communicate to the world indigenous life, our connection with the land and spirituality, how we've experienced the outsiders coming into our lands, the missionaries, the oil companies, the government, so that we could really connect with people around the world and create this movement of global solidarity to protect the Amazon rainforest.
Yeah, you talked earlier about, you both dedicated your lives to protecting the Amazon and giving a voice to indigenous communities. And through this book, as we talked about, this is finally being written in written word for people to be able to read, and people to share, and people to learn about what's happening and what everything that happened throughout your childhood. So the next question I'll ask, I mean, going back to your mission in life, both of your missions, and I'll actually ask you this, Mitch, first. I'll ask you, Amazon Frontlines, y'all co-founded this. I think it was in 2015. I think is the stat that I have. But can you talk about the work of Amazon Frontlines and the mission behind the organization and how it was created back in 2015?
Would you like me to answer that? You said, yeah. Well, good to be on this show with you. For more than 70 years now, American oil companies and international oil companies have been operating in the upper Amazon, in Ecuador and Peru and Colombia. They caused a massive environmental disaster over decades, deliberately dumping toxic wastewaters into the rivers and streams that indigenous peoples depended on and had been stewarding and protecting for thousands of years. Spilled roughly 18 million gallons of oil just into the northeastern part of the Ecuadorian Amazon, and just caused a massive public health and environmental crisis, all in the name of profit. And there's been, intense international litigation to try to hold companies like Chevron or Occidental Petroleum to account for this massive environmental pollution. And, in 2011, after working for a long time trying to hold these companies to account, I ended up moving to the Amazon. I had met, community leaders, men and women, who just some of the most generous, joyful, loving, beautiful people that I'd ever known, and who had experienced horrifying loss. Emergildo Criollo, a Cofan man who Nemonte writes about and we write about in the book, had lost two of his children to oil contamination. They were playing in the river, ingested toxic water, and within 24 hours died. And in 2011, with Emerhildo and other indigenous leaders, we started a water project together to build clean water systems, rainwater catchment systems across all of the villages in the Ecuadorian Amazon affected by oil contamination. And, over several years of working to build access to clean water, the youth, the dreamers of the indigenous communities really organized and joined together. Nemonte, who comes from an area of rainforest that doesn't have oil development, doesn't have oil extraction and contamination, joined the project, joined the movement, saw for the first time the effects, the environmental and cultural impacts of oil contamination, saw an oil spill for the first time. And Nemonte really was this spark of like, this is powerful. We're building clean water. We're making sure that our kids, our families have access to clean water, but we need to stop the destruction from happening. We need to defend our lands against the miners, against the oil companies. We need to build solutions from the ground up. And so that was in 2014, where we basically built an organization, the Sabo Alliance, which is an indigenous-led nonprofit organization, and Amazon Frontlines, to join forces and to really create a vision for protection across the whole upper Amazon, lifting up indigenous cultures and creating solutions from the ground up. So over the last, you're right, since 2014, 2015, over the last decade, we've been working together. We're a collective of, indigenous leaders and Western activists working on the front lines, creating strategies to take on the oil industry, not cede an inch to new emerging oil operations and oil auctions and leases, stopping the miners from entering into territories, stopping networks of illegal loggers, stopping the poachers. But also we're building strategies to get land back, to secure indigenous guardianship across more territory. Because as you said, when indigenous peoples are protecting and stewarding their land, there's better outcomes. The forest, canopy cover, the wildlife, animals, biodiversity, it's all more protected than in national parks. We're also working with indigenous women and indigenous youth to build solutions and to dream big about revolutionizing the educational system so that honors indigenous traditions and cultures, building out economic alternatives like regenerative economies, and then, working to change the system, platforming indigenous leaders and amplifying indigenous values and stories around the world, precisely so the world can realize that when indigenous peoples are stewarding and able to protect their lands, we can protect the entire Amazon rainforest and really stop the climate crisis. Indigenous peoples are only 5% of the global population, but protect 80% of our Earth's biodiversity. So there's a statistic that, just sit with that one. And that's what Amazon Frontlines and the Sabo Alliance is doing. And this book is a memoir of, Nemonte's story, her people's collective struggle, but it's also the founding story of Amazon Frontlines and the Sabo Alliance.
I'll ask Nemonte another question here. And the question in my head, I just think of how challenging it's got to be for anyone to go against these huge corporations that have such deep pockets that, in a lot of ways just control so much of what we do. And, my question, and a question I have a lot to a lot of people is, in communities, a lot of times people will, promote the economics over the environment, over the social aspects. And it's almost like always money is king. But the problem with that logic is in a situation like the Amazon, we talked about, I think 35% of the territory is protected by indigenous communities. When these companies are coming in and drilling and mining and destroying the areas, there's going to be ramifications way down the line, current ramifications and future ramifications that are going to impact the environment, that are going to impact the economy as well. Because these areas, there's huge exports from these areas as well that people need to know about. That's kind of going all across the world. But my question is, when you go and are fighting against these big oil companies or big corporations, how do you go about it? Because I'm interested in just the process of how you do that, how you stand strong and protect the land that your people have lived on.
Pues ahí es pregunta muy importante que los líderes del pueblo tienen que escuchar, porque ya subimos como
Nemonte said that, for her, if you read the book, We Will Be Jaguars, you'll realize that she came from, and she comes from, a forest that's still untouched by oil extraction. And so when she was a young woman, it was the first time that she had really experienced the devastation of oil destruction when she went to visit the Cofan, Siona, and Sequoia people in Ecuador's northern Amazon. Not only did she see the impacts of oil contamination, but of roads into the forest, of African palm plantations, of cattle ranching. And so then she realized that this is going to happen in our territory. This is going to happen in our territory, and the industries are going to divide our people. And so what she did was she had this idea of bringing the elders and bringing the youth of the Warani people to visit, to see what happens with communities, to hear the stories of indigenous leaders that have been living downriver now for 50 years from oil contamination, or surrounded by African palm, or homesteading colonists. And when she did that, the people saw, and they realized that we can't be divided. We can't just think about short-term economics. We need to think about union, protecting our land for the long term, because that is what gives us life. That's what's sustaining us. And so once we had union, then I thought, you know what? We need to make sure that the women are the ones that are leading these battles, because women and women's leadership, we're thinking about our children. We're connected to the earth. We think about harmony and consensus and building the collective. And so we had women leaders in the front. We listened to our elders, their guidance, and respected our elders. And then we began leveraging the tools of the Western world, technologies, litigation strategy, communications, and we took it to the government, and we won. And we set a huge precedent. We protected 500,000 acres of our land. And then we also set a precedent to protect 7 million acres more of territory against this illegal oil auction.
So one more question I have for you, Mitch, before we talk about that 500,000 acres that was protected. But recently, and I don't know what month of the year it was, but in 2024, Amazon Frontlines was awarded the Hilton Humanitarian Prize. And I'm interested to know what the prize is, what it's going to mean for your organization, and how that all came to be as well. So yeah, could you just talk a little bit about that prize, of the Hilton Humanitarian Prize?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, the Hilton Prize is a huge honor. We received it last week. There was a ceremony in Los Angeles. It's often referred to as the Nobel Prize for NGOs. It's awarded once a year. And Amazon Frontlines is the first climate organization to win this prize in the whole prize history. We're the first organization in South America to win the prize. And we're the first collective of Western and Indigenous activists to win this prize. So it's really special. A lot of firsts there. It also comes with $2.5 million. So it's a significant prize award. And, we're going to leverage the validation of this prize and the funding to grow our work and scale our work. We're going to be investing in Frontlines communities and solutions across the Amazon. We're going to use this prize to unlock new funding streams so that we can rise to the moment, meet the challenges facing the Amazon rainforest. Nemonte, and I were on stage receiving the prize. Our friend Leonardo DiCaprio was there as well. He was the one that presented us with the prize. And it was super powerful because Nemonte was on stage. She took a deep breath, closed her eyes, and then she said, "We deserve this prize. We deserve this recognition." And what that meant to me, and I think what it meant to everybody there, what we heard was Indigenous peoples for hundreds of years have been protecting their lands, have been confronting conquest, threats to their territory, swimming alone upstream to protect Mother Earth. And now we're in the midst of this climate crisis. And Indigenous peoples continue to put their bodies on the line, their lives on the line, continue to protect their forests, their homes. As you said, 35% of the entire Amazon or more is protected by Indigenous peoples. 80% of our biodiversity is protected by Indigenous peoples. And Nemonte said it. We deserve this. Indigenous peoples deserve to be recognized. We deserve this honor, and we need more support. And, Amazon Frontlines, we're going to grow our organization and scale our impacts across the Amazon, we're going to build out a regional strategy to stop the miners, stop the oil companies, stop the threats to Indigenous defenders. We're going to also build out a plan to title Indigenous territories to secure Indigenous guardianship across the Amazon. There's potential to upwards of 10 million hectares of lands that we can return into Indigenous hands. That'll, promote, conservation, ensure that the upper Amazon remains a carbon sink and a storehouse of biodiversity. And we're going to continue to invest in solutions. The Amazon is not only facing an ecological tipping point, but it's facing a cultural tipping point. And so investing in Indigenous youth and Indigenous women in educational systems that honor Indigenous culture, Indigenous language, Indigenous values is going to be important so that the next generation of Indigenous leaders are connected with their lands, can continue to lead their people, make the right decisions to protect their forests. And then we need to build out regenerative economies that honor and respect the land, and pivot away from these violent extractive economies that are decimating the forest, decimating our climate, decimating Indigenous cultures. And ultimately, Indigenous peoples need to have a seat at the table in climate negotiations, in every global space where decisions that affect their lands and affect Mother Earth are happening. And, that's why we're going to be working to lift up Indigenous leaders, their stories, their values, their perspectives.
So one question, and I should know this. I apologize. I should have known this from the research, but Amazon Frontlines as an organization, how far is your reach as an organization across South America?
Ahorita estamos trabajando Ecuador, Perú, Colombia, el fronterizo. Estamos muchos años ya apoyando.
So Amazon Frontlines, our focus is regional. It's the upper Amazon. We're based in Ecuador, Colombia, and Peru, working with Indigenous nations across territories of the headwaters of the Amazon and Indigenous peoples that are living across borders, these political borders between Ecuador, Colombia, and Peru.
So another question I'd ask, just because I'm very curious about how the process works. How important is government intervention with the work that you're trying to do, especially when thinking about like the big oil companies, the big corporations that are trying to come into the areas? How important is government intervention, and has that been a challenge for Amazon Frontlines throughout, I guess, the last 9 to 10 years of existing?
Nemo asked me to respond to this question. So first and foremost, Amazon Frontline's work is focused on supporting Indigenous self-determination, Indigenous autonomy, working with Indigenous people, communities, leaders, youth, elders, to develop strategies to protect their lands, to uplift their cultures, and to build solutions. A lot of times, governments across the region are extraordinarily focused on short-term economic gain and political interests. And so, side with industry, whether it's the oil industry or the mining industry, to essentially rake in huge profits in the short term at the expense of long-term sustainability, at the expense of Indigenous autonomy and sovereignty and well-being. So a lot of our work has been in opposition to reckless and wayward governments that are focused on greedy deals with industry. We're looking to advance precedent. We're looking to advance Indigenous rights and enshrine Indigenous rights in constitutions, to shape policy frameworks. And we are looking to work with governments as well so that they can enforce and implement the rights of Indigenous peoples, the human rights, the rights of nature. But oftentimes, politicians are beholden to lobbyists and corporate interests and, quarterly cycles and election cycles. So we are not afraid to take very strong positions in support of Indigenous autonomy against government corruption and against government extractive interests. That being said, Nemonte, has, led important process, for instance, on Indigenous education and intercultural education, and from the ground up has built with her community, with the women, with the elders, a new model of education for the Warani people. And we're working with the Ministry of Education to get them to adopt this strategy and to help us scale it, to help fund it. We're also working with the ministry in Ecuador right now to help them produce a pathway to title indigenous lands within protected areas. Indigenous peoples are currently living in essentially a landlord-tenant relationship within protected areas across Ecuador. They don't have permanent titles to their ancestral lands. They have to sign MOUs with the Ministry of Environment. So, we're working through the legal avenue, but also through policy frameworks and negotiations to get the government to create pathways to permanently title indigenous lands so that they have rights over their territories and can better protect it.
So you mentioned earlier this legal case that was won protecting 500,000 acres of territory, and this was back in 2019. And this was really a landmark for indigenous rights in Ecuador. And I would just ask Nemonte here, can you talk about this legal victory, what it meant for indigenous people, and how it again set a precedent moving forward for the community?
Para mí, honestamente, como mujer guaraní, significaba que nuestras comunidades, nuestro pueblo siguen viviendo alegres, dignos.
It was a big victory. It was a big victory for the forests, for indigenous peoples across Ecuador and around the world. And really for me as a Guarani woman, as a leader, but also as a mother, what it meant for me and what it meant for our people was that our territory was protected. It was safe from the violence of extractive industry. The rivers were safe from contamination. It meant that we were going to be able to continue to live peacefully, flourish in our lands, enjoy the river, eating wild fruits, harvesting from our gardens. That's what it meant for me. And then it also was an energizing moment for the indigenous movement because we united around a common cause to protect our homes, to protect our lands, and we won. And it showed the power of union, showed the power of what we can do when we come together as indigenous peoples and across cultures and with folks from around the world. So it was powerful in a deep way because it was about protecting our home. And it was also powerful because we created a model for indigenous organizing and winning victories that matter.
Yeah, the question I was going to ask, you just answered of how did this influence other indigenous communities across the Amazon? But what it sounds like is this kind of gave motivation to the entire indigenous community. I mean, it showed that cases like this can be won. Cases this is a huge case study that we can use, which is really cool. And then one thing more recently, another huge win I would say is the Ecuadorian ban on oil extraction in the Yasuni National Park. I think this was back in 2023. So, I would ask the question here, just to talk about, this victory as well, and, what this has meant for the indigenous community.
El Yasuní es territorio guaraní ancestral de nuestro territorio y nuestras abuelas también está enterado y también viven los dos grupos, aislamientos voluntarios, Tagueri y Taromenani.
Yeah, no, so Yasuni, that's a forest in the eastern part of the Ecuadorian Amazon, and it is one of the most biodiverse rainforests on the planet. And Nemonte said it's also the home of her people, the Warani people. It's where her grandmother is buried. It's also the home of indigenous peoples living in voluntary isolation, her relatives, the Tagueri and the Taromenani. And beneath Yasuni, there's millions and millions and millions of barrels of oil. And for decades, the government and the oil industry has been salivating over extracting all of that oil. And over the last decade, oil company has been in Yasuni extracting oil. And so we were able to, over 10 years of community organizing, indigenous peoples, climate activists across Ecuador, get the Yasuni forest and the question of whether or not to extract oil and continue to extract oil in Yasuni onto a ballot, a national referendum. And it was a big moment because it was what matters more, the life of the forest or extracting that oil? And it was a yes or no question. And so we organized around that ballot initiative. And as Indigenous peoples, we were at the forefront, both nationally and internationally. And Nemonte said she organized delegations with Amazon Frontlines of Indigenous leaders to Yasuni, to the forest, to share with the entire Ecuadorian population the importance of that forest, the biodiversity, the connection of Indigenous peoples to that land, the importance of protecting it. And ultimately, the entire Ecuadorian people voted, over 60% of the people voted to protect life over oil profits. And so it was a really powerful victory. It set a precedent internationally, inspired many people as one of the first models for climate democracy. And at the same time, the presidential elections, the candidates were all promising to respect the will of the people. But once this current president was elected, he backed out of his promise to the people. And instead of forcing the oil industry to leave Yasuni, he's allowing the oil industry to continue operating, to continue extracting oil. And so that's why we're still organizing now to really force the issue and make sure that we're able to get the oil industry to pack their bags and get out of Indigenous territory and get out of the most biodiverse forests on the planet.
Yeah, so I think we understand. I mean, this incredible work that's been done since 2014, 2015. I mean, the project protecting 500,000 acres of land, then this with protecting the Yasuni National Forest, and then also with this award that you won of $2.5 million. I mean, this is a lot of wins that have strung together of 10 years of work and of hard work that's gone into this, and two books that are incredible. My question would be, where do you go from here? We have these huge wins. You have this funding, but my question is, what is your vision for the Amazon and for Indigenous communities going forward?
Mi visión es no solamente los pueblos indígenas pueden estar al frente de línea de solución cambio climático.
So my vision for the future is that we can grow our organization, but that the world recognizes that it's not just up to Indigenous peoples and people fighting on the front lines to protect our earth, to protect their forests, to protect our climate, but that the people around the world recognize and realize that their way of life, this endless desire to consume and consume and consume, is systematically threatening Mother Earth and our territories. And I want to build at Amazon Frontlines a global movement that not only can support Indigenous Frontlines organizing to protect our lands and our resources against threats, but to build a global movement that wakes up consciousness and that learns to respect Mother Earth so that we don't have to fight these threats, so that we can create a world and a society and an economy that honors Mother Earth and that lives within our means. That's my vision. That's my big vision for where we need to go next in the movement.
So final two questions here. The first one is, you talk about making this a global movement. If people listening to this want to get involved, where can they do that and how can they do that? And then secondly, if any of the listeners want to get their hands on the book, where can they find that as well?
Yo podría decir, la gente que están escuchando este mensaje, yo diría, vayan a librería.
So for me, the first thing is we wrote this book, We Will Be Jaguars. It's a story of my life, a story of my people, and it's a message to the world, and it's a love letter to the world. And so I want everybody to read this story, to read We Will Be Jaguars. You can go and buy it at any of your bookstores. It's in every bookstore. You can buy it on all of the, from bookshop.org, Amazon. We also have a website for the book called We Will Be Jaguars, which is a place where once you've read the book, you can come and visit. You can leave messages on a message board and share your perspectives and your experience with the book. We really want people to also, once they read the book, to then share the book with your friends, with your community. We want you to help us give this book and this story wings. We want you to help this book and this story live, as Nemonte says in the introduction to the book. We also want you to get involved at our organization, Amazon Frontlines, amazonfrontlines.org. You can sign up. We are going to be sharing on the ground updates from the Amazon, ways that you can get involved, ways that you can take action. As always, we need resources as well on the front line. So becoming a monthly sustainer will be helpful as well. We will be jaguars.org, amazonfrontlines.org. That's the way you can stay in touch with us, get involved, educate yourselves around this issue. And there's ways to take action now.